Hello, my friends. In today's modern world, we're given so many messages about diet and nutrition. And from the mainstream media, predominantly, those messages are saturated fat is very bad, very dangerous, and you should avoid it. And fiber is very good, and you're not eating enough of it. And so today I have the honor and the pleasure of having Dr. Zoë Harcombe with me here today from across the Atlantic Ocean. Zoe, welcome. So glad to have you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure. When we were over for the conference in London, Nisha and I, Zoe and her hilarious husband, and Isabella Cooper and some others went out to dinner together, had some steak.
We did.
And I think Zoe maybe had a side. I did not. You're more low carb keto on average, correct?
Yeah, it was what was it? It was like it had cheese and lots of dressing and on a bit of lettuce. So it was a good side. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So for this next hour, we're going to be talking about dietary recommendations, where they come from, why the governments of many countries are so interested in promoting a certain dietary options and demonizing other dietary options, where that comes from. So Zoe has been researching diet nutrition for over a decade, correct, Zoe?
Yeah, nearer 20 years
Yeah.
actually.
And what you
Start
guys
looking
may not
old.
know is even though she has a PhD in nutrition, she is very attuned to the politics of the day and political shenanigans. So I think she's the perfect person to have this conversation with to talk about. Okay, so even if fiber were, knighted and sainted, if it were perfect, if it were an essential nutrient, why are governments so interested in promoting it? Before we get started, Zoe, tell everybody, give us a little quick CV on you.
Okay. Right, really quick. First interest in food started when my brother developed type 1 diabetes when he was 15 and I was 13. And that introduced me to the power of glucose, carbohydrate, and insulin. Wind forward, I went to Cambridge University. I did maths and economics. I'm fascinated by numbers. And I started noticing that people were starting to get larger around me. And when I was at school, we only had one overweight child in the class, and you would sit next to them at lunch so that you could give them the stuff that you didn't want to eat. And it was just starting to explode. And my mum was then replacing the stuff in the fridge and putting in this low fat margarine. And we had these 1 calorie drinks. And the world around me was kind of changing. And I then left Cambridge. I went to be a management consultant. I ended up in human resources. I worked in marketing, global organizations. I had a fantastic, what you would call blue chip, normal career, ending up as HR director at places like SmithKline Beecham. So I've done drugs. I met Andy, my husband, working for Mars. So I've done Candy as well. So I know these organizations from the inside. And then it got to 2009. And by this time, I'd written one book in 2004 called Why Do You Overeat When All You Want Is to Be Slim? Because I was fascinated by this obesity epidemic that I could see emerging around me. I then wrote a book called Stop Counting Calories and Start Losing Weight. And that was at the point where I thought, okay, let's see if I can make what I'm really passionate about what I do and walk away from the corporate world with the big salary and the bonus and the final salary pension scheme and all that kind of thing. And I've never looked back. So I then did a PhD in public health nutrition, specifically in dietary fat guidelines. I speak at conferences as you do. I would normally have been at the PHC, but we had a wedding. So I'm out trying to tell the good folk the truth about food and diet and health.
Yes. Now, for those of you watching this on YouTube or other social media, this was actually filmed live in front of our private community. And we will be taking questions from our tribe members. So tribe members, if you have a question about fat, about fiber, about the interplay of big food, big pharma, and big government, put your questions in the comments and I'll be looking for those as we go along. So where do you want to start with this, Zoe? Do you want to start with fat or fiber or the interconnectedness of big food, big government, big pharma?
I think fat, because if I just pick up on the connection with obesity from the introduction, as I was seeing obesity rise, being a mathematician, being logical, for something to change, something must change. So I was then fascinated by what has changed. And I started looking at numbers. So I would say the classic argument is people have got fatter because we're eating more and we're doing less. So I looked for the UK at the intake of calories over a period of time during which obesity has started to explode, and we'd actually been eating less. And I looked at activity, and we'd actually been doing more. I mean, when I was younger, nobody was cycling, nobody was running marathons, nobody was doing all this ultra stuff. They weren't doing yoga and jogging, and they just weren't. I mean, people just went about their normal lives and ate real food, and things were okay. So I started becoming interested in what could have caused the obesity epidemic. And there's a brilliant chart from Hens, which shows obesity in the US taking off between about 1976 and 1980. It's literally like an airplane taking off. Everyone will know the chart. So you look at that inflection point and you say, what happened then? Now, something really important happened then. And I set about exploring the hypothesis that that very important event was the explanation behind obesity. And of course, the important event was that our dietary guidelines changed, or more particularly, the US introduced dietary guidelines. Senator McGovern, failed presidential candidate, they always go and do troublesome things, see Al Gore. He wanted to make a difference in the world, so he wanted to move from setting dietary guidelines for people who were in poverty to setting dietary guidelines for everyone. So that was 1977. He'd been on a Pritikin boot camp. He therefore thought low fat was the way to go. Nick Motton, who was involved in the setting of the guidelines, was vegetarian, so he had an agenda. And those were then embedded, what they came up with, in the dietary guidelines for Americans in 1980. And of course, they then get replenished or revised or whatever, not very much revised, just reissued every 5 years. And they become more and more plant-based. And it's basically eat plants, don't eat animals, eat carbs, don't eat fat, eat low fat, eat high carbohydrate. And obesity took off then. So until somebody can give me a better explanation, I'm pinning myself to the explanation that our dietary guidelines have caused the epidemics of diabetes and obesity.
That does seem like a very rational hypothesis, because if you go back and look at that time period between 71, 77, 1980, I don't really see anything else that changed. I know the US FDA adopted that and really started promoting that about 1980. In the UK, where you are, when did your federal or your national government adopt that and start to actively promote that? Was it around the same time?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, actually. So we had an important committee meeting in 1983, and then in 1984, I've got to read this out because it's just the most fabulous quote. We came out with the statement, base your meals on starchy foods, which is essentially what the US had come out with. And the UK actually put in this government document the previous nutritional advice in the UK to limit the intake of all carbohydrates as a means of weight control, that's what they did believe, now runs counter to current thinking. The problem then becomes one of achieving both a reduction in fat to no more than 30% of total energy and a reduction in saturated fat to no more than 10%. And those were the two dietary guidelines that basically came in around that time, 77 to 80 in the US, 83 to 84 in the UK. And they have been there ever since. And that's...
And when you look at the data from both countries, do you see a time lag between the takeoff of obesity, which, if your hypothesis is correct, you would expect for the obesity epidemic to lag 3 years or so behind the US? Do you see that in the data?
God, let me remember the data off the top of my head. So UK citizens, I happen to remember that obesity rates among men and women in 1972 in the UK were 2.7%. Wind forward to 1999, and I do know these numbers, for men they were 22.6%, and for women they were 25, I think it was 0.8, but they were definitely the 22.6 and 25 something. So we pretty much tenfold increased obesity. Now, we didn't have the inflection that you guys did. It was almost as if some stuff was coming across the pond before we formalized it. You guys just have this just incredible inflection, but we just had the steady increase. But that was the start of the obesity epidemic from what I can see.
Yeah. And going back to what you said earlier, I remember from my kindergarten class, probably the entire class was probably 120 kids. And we had the obligatory one fat kid. He was one of my best friends. We would play, and he was very active. He ate the same food we ate, but he was severely obese by any current guidelines. I didn't actually measure his BMI back then because I was a kindergarten kid. But I used to poke his belly. I don't know if you remember the Pillsbury Doughboy commercial, and then he
Yeah,
would
I
giggle
do.
at the Pillsbury Doughboy. But I wasn't bullying him. We were just
Yeah.
friends, and he had this obvious, just like if he'd had red hair, we would have called him Carrot Top and played with him. That just was, he was just a fat kid.
Yeah.
But there was one, and you had one in your class.
Yeah.
And I think if many of our listeners, if you're in your 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, you remember you either had one fat kid in your first grade class or none. And now I suspect if Zoe or I went back to our little kindergarten school, wherever that happens to be,
Yeah.
and we did a little survey and measured BMIs, there's more than one fat kid.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
there's
so
a lot more.
this is the reason I had that one fat kid in my class and you and yours is because they were eating so much more saturated fat than any of the other kids in class. And they were not eating enough fiber and starchy vegetables. Do you think that's what was going on, Zoë Harcombe?
If only, if only. So I became fascinated in this, and I wanted to get to the bottom of it. And I didn't realize that this was going to end up being my PhD topic, but I was such a nerd. I was reading the 20 volumes of the 7 countries study to see what it was saying about total fat and saturated fat, just for fun. And then I got the opportunity to start a PhD in 2012. So my PhD basically said, if you look at an evidence pyramid, the lowest form of evidence is, my mate, anecdotal evidence. Then you've got case studies. It's not very much further up that you get the epidemiological studies that Harvard just love to churn out by the 100-fold. Then you get into things like randomized controlled trials. And then up at the top, we've got this relatively new technique. It's been around since about 76, but it's really been used a lot in the last 10 years. And it's called systematic review and meta-analysis. So what it says is we're not going to do any cherry picking. We're going to get a topic and we're going to go in and we are going to look at all the evidence, whether we like it or not, whether it supports our hypothesis or not. We must go in as proper scientists, not knowing what we're going to find. So I did this for my PhD on the dietary fat guidelines. So I did it in 2 ways. I said, first of all, I want to pretend that I'm the head of the committee back in 1977 in the US and then in 1983 in the UK. There was one more trial that became available between those dates. And I want to look at the randomized controlled trials. First of all, that's the highest level of evidence that I can pull together in this technique called meta-analysis, because that's what meta-analysis is. And I want to see what the totality of the data tell me. So that first paper came out in 2015. It's by far the most important paper from the PhD because it's the evidence at the time that should have informed those committees to say this is what you need to do. Now I'll cut to the chase. There's 6 trials basically that the UK people could look at, 5 that the US people could look at. You'll have heard of things like the Woodhill Sydney Diet Heart Study, the Rose Cornwall trial, the Low Fat Research Committee trial. People have heard of these trials. You pull them together and there was absolutely no difference whatsoever between the intervention group and the control group. And the intervention groups variously would add olive oil or add corn oil or take out certain fats or change the whole diet so that you're not eating eggs and real food anymore, you're eating all these low-fat marges. And in some cases, there were actually more deaths in the intervention groups. It's just when they were pulled together, they didn't reach statistical significance. Now, the other couple of treasures that came out of that study, it made global headlines. I mean, it reached Sydney, New Zealand, Time magazine, the whole lot. Only 2,500 people were involved in those 6 trials. They were all men. We had not studied a single female at the time we changed the dietary guidelines. They were all sick men. They had all already had a heart attack. So we didn't study a single healthy person when we suddenly changed dietary guidelines for every healthy person. And not one single trial individually or all the pooled trials together said that you should reduce dietary fat as a result of that evidence. It's unbelievable how
Well, let me
bad
get this
this
straight.
is.
Although the USDA now MyPlate guidelines, it says at the very beginning of the document that this is the recommended pattern of eating for healthy individuals. You're saying that all the research that went into forming these guidelines was not performed on healthy young people. It was performed on elderly male people who had already had a heart attack. That's where the
Yeah.
majority of the research came from.
Yeah, not necessarily elderly. So I pulled out the page from my PhD earlier on. So they did vary in ages. I didn't pull out all of the age information, but some of them were very much middle aged. So they might be 40s, 50s, 60s, but had already had a heart attack. No healthy people studied, no women studied. So when these dietary guidelines were originally set, and we haven't moved away from them, the totality of the trial evidence was on sick men, middle-aged or older. Now, I also looked at, just to be fair, all the epidemiological evidence at the trial at the time, and you had things like the Western Electric study. The most famous by far, of course, was the 7 countries study. Pulled all of those together. Again, there were 6 trials. Those involved more men. It was more like 30,000 because you're looking at a population. You're not actually doing an intervention. You're just trying to look at associations between mortality and fat intake, or coronary heart disease mortality and saturated fat intake. And not many people know this, but of those 6 studies, none of them found anything against total fat whatsoever. One of them found, which is the 7 countries study, Keyes said, I think there's an association between saturated fat, cholesterol in the blood, and coronary heart disease. But when you read the 7 countries study for what Keyes actually thought was saturated fat, because our nutrition knowledge wasn't as good at the time, he would refer to things like cakes and ice cream as saturated fat. Well, don't blame the fat, don't blame the butter in the cake for what the sugar and the flour did. And that was at the time. And then the second part of my PhD was to bring that up to date and to say, okay, I'm doing this now in 2016. We're not back in 1983. What evidence do we have available now? We have a few more trials, the Women's Health Initiative, the Minnesota Coronary Survey. Some healthy people started to be included. Some women started to be included. Pull all the evidence together and guess what? A big fat 0 yet again. And the same for the epidemiological evidence.
So with all these studies, and every nutrition researcher, every dietary guideline person, they had access to all this research.
Yep.
But yet still, we came out with guidelines that were limit cholesterol intake, dietarily speaking, limit saturated fat, limit all fat, but prioritize starchy vegetables, fruits and vegetables, whole grain bread, etc. Where's the disconnect there? The people who formed these guidelines, they had to have PhD, nutrition PhDs, medicine PhDs. They had to have people like that working on this, right? Because that's the people you would want their opinion. Yeah. So if they weren't in the room, who was in the room?
You make a really good point there, actually, because the other thing that I read word by word was the dietary guidelines document. So the stuff written by Nick Motton, the long 800-page document, as well as the short version. And they didn't cite those 6 randomized controlled trials. I think variously one was cited by the UK committee, one might have been cited, or I think it was just the 7 country study that was cited by one of them. There were 12 trials between the epidemiological studies and the RCTs, and they didn't cite them. So they didn't seem to understand that they needed to go and look at the evidence at the time. Was it Robert Olson? There was a senator, because you have the Senate committees that you have nowadays.
Right.
So the person in charge was this McGovern character who, as I say, wanted to make a name for himself. He'd already decided low fat was the way to go. Fake food companies would be represented on the panels and as part of the discussion. And of course, if they can see that the government is going to start moving people away from eggs and butter and towards margarines and spreads and bread and cereals, it's, Christmas come early. So they just simply did not look at the evidence. And there was one guy, I'm sure it was Robert Olson, who said, Senator, I plead with you. We're about to do something we've never done before. I really don't think we've got the evidence to be doing this. And McGovern replied, and there's a video clip of this in a documentary on the dietary guidelines. He replied, unlike you journalists, we don't have the luxury of time. We need to do something and we need to do it now. So, well, actually, you did have the luxury of time. You didn't need to do anything. There was no apparent epidemic of obesity or diabetes at the time, and yet we've managed to create both of those over the last 30 to 40 years.
And I think you understand as well as I do that McGovern's being pressed for time wasn't that we've got to get these guidelines out because they're going to help Americans. His pressure, his time pressure was, I need to do something really big and important for my own political career. And given today's current affairs, I think we all understand the pressure on political animals to do things that promote their own career as quickly as possible. Now, you mentioned Big Food was in the room. Why is Big Food so in love with low fat? How does that help Big Food's bottom line? Kellogg's, General Mills, Kraft Heinz, Mondelez. How do they? How does it help their bottom line to make low fat food?
Yeah, because animal foods, which is the alternative. So if we look at real food, which is meat, fish, eggs, dairy, veg salad, nuts and seeds. Grains can be real food. It depends how they're processed, and legumes. They come quite naturally, and they're not very easy to put a markup on. We both buy meat. The butcher has got a limited margin. He's got to look after the cow. He's got to get it to market and so on. When you take some meat and mix it up with flour and other products and sugar and vegetable oils and maltodextrin and things that look more like a chemistry set, and then you put it in a nice box and you make it a nice small portion and you put a calorie count on the side, you can sell it for vastly more money. So there's just nothing for the fake food industry if we go back to eating real food, let alone if we shun most real food and eat just meat, which I know you do and others do.
And I'm just a common sense country boy, Zoe. And so when I first got into this and started looking into this, it seemed to my common sense mind that if a farmer, a rancher, raised a cow and then butchered the cow and then sold the steaks and the ground beef and stuff, that he is in control of the full profit funnel. That should be, and he didn't have to ship it anywhere. He sold it from his farm. He should be making a huge percentage markup. But in reality, that's not the case at all. And in fact, modern ranchers, most of the bigger ranchers, they're not involved in the middle part and the end part. They just literally raise the calf and put a few hundred pounds on it, and then they sell it to a middleman. And some of those ranchers are making literally 2 or 3 or 4% profit off for their work. So then my common sense country boy head said, well, so you're telling me that Kraft Heinz, Mondelez, whoever, they can grow peaches in South America, then ship them to Malaysia to be packaged, and then ship them back to America, and then have this beautiful container they're in that they had to pay designers and ergonomists, all these people, and then put them on the grocery store shelf. You're telling me that they make 100% markup, somewhere between 100% and 10,000% markup. And you see where for a common sense minded person, you're like, there's no way. I mean, you're going to put this on a cargo ship from South America to Malaysia, back to America, and then you have to pay all the advertising, all the marketing, all the packaging, and then often pay for shelf space on the supermarket. But yet you're making 1,000% markup, where the guy that just raises a cow and slaughters it and sells it on his farm is making maybe a 50% markup, maybe, if he keeps everything in his barn, so to speak. Yeah. The average mind can't comprehend that. They're like, that doesn't make any sense, but that's really the truth of the matter, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's even worse in things like the cereal market. So the work of Belinda Fettke, I'm sure you're familiar with, where she traced back, we'll probably edge into fiber a little bit now, but she traced back where the whole cereal myth came from. And of course, you've got Sylvester Graham, Graham's Crackers, you've got John Harvey Kellogg, these guys in the late 1800s who developed these products. You could take a handful of oats and sell them for a certain price, or a handful of corn, but the minute you can turn it into an Oatibix or a cornflakes and then put it in some big fancy packet with a toy that's going to attract the kid and loads of sugar, which is really cheap, and sell it as some big box breakfast sensation or whatever, you're in a whole different ball game again. And there's a lot of people want us away from eating real food. There's a real agenda of making us unhealthy at the moment, that you inevitably get into big politics, because if you don't, you're not thinking outside the box, because you have to be saying, why is the plant-based agenda utterly relentless at the moment, when anyone who looks at nutrition knows what do we need to eat and where do we find it? And you come to one answer, and it isn't the cereal box with the toy in the bottom.
Yeah, and here's a question from one of our tribe members, B. Rose. And B Rose she's in the same silo as you and I. And sometimes when you hear the low carb, keto, carnivore message every day and you're putting it out there, you just assume that everybody knows about this, right? But in reality, that's not true at all. Maybe 10% of the population has ever heard of keto or carnivore in a positive light. B Rose says, are dietary guidelines changing for the better in the UK faster than in the USA? I see Dr. Unwin. This is Dr. David Unwin, a close friend of Zoe and mine. We love the work he's doing. We see his contributions to correcting the information. But so I want your comment on that, but then also please explain to people how the proper human diet message is so siloed by social media and then completely excluded by mainstream media that the majority of people have never heard of Dr. David Unwin.
Yeah. I wish I could say that it's had a huge impact, but unfortunately, in terms of the guidelines that are officially set in the UK, it's had no impact whatsoever. So we had our dietary guidelines were presented in a plate, which back in 1994 was called the Balance of Good Health Plate. And that then, it's taxing my memory here, it's working well at the moment. That then became the Eat Well plate, they call it. I call it the Eat Badly plate. And that was introduced in 2007, and that was under the guidance of the Food Standards Agency. That was then picked up by the body called Public Health England, which is no longer Public Health England. After COVID, it was called the Health Security Agency or something very creepy. The idea that they're responsible for our entire health, including masks and jabs and other stuff we might not want to get into. Anyway, so they picked up the I have to call it Eat Badly plate, and they made it the Eat Well guide, which is the Eat Badly guide. That was revised in 2016. They tinkered around with it. I mean, the Eat Badly plate was particularly heinous. It had a can of Coca-Cola on it. It was just full of grains and starchy things. You would have to spot the meat and fish and eggs. It didn't change very much in 2016. What they did is they put the junk off the plate to the left-hand side, but then arguably your eyes were more drawn to it than they were when it was part of the plate. You kind of look, what's down in the left-hand side? Oh, it's the fizzy drink and the crisps and the chocolate bar and the biscuits, because that has to have a place in a healthy diet. You do understand, you can't put a plate up of healthy eating and not encourage people still to eat those kinds of things.
Yeah, and so to me, again, my common sense mind, just the audacity of putting a Coca-Cola on the cover of dietary guidelines promoted by your government.
Yep.
You're just like, no, that can't be true. I'll have to see a picture of that. I don't believe that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. I've seen the picture, and so is Zoe, and we're happy to share that on social media if you don't believe that. But yes, they had a picture of chocolate and a Coca-Cola on the cover of the dietary guidelines.
I got to tell you a funny story, Ken. I got to tell you a funny story. So when my paper came out in 2015, the government was apoplectic because it was picked up by so many media outlets, and we had columnists in the UK saying, what do you mean I never needed to give up meat and butter and cheese? They were really, really tamping. So the head of Public Health England at the time, who was called Dr. Alison Tedstone, she was head of nutrition, they did a programme following my paper, and Asim was on it. I think Nina might have been interviewed for it as well. It went right into our community, and this guy was really curious, the presenter, and he was like, I really want to get to the bottom of this. So he had Alison Tedstone on. So he's doing an interview with her that's going into the half-hour radio programme. And he said, so why is there a can of cola on your role model plate for healthy eating? And she said, there isn't. He said, yes, there is. And it just went quiet. And you can just imagine that she went back to Public Health England, and she had steam coming out of her ears, and she's like, why is there a can of Coca-Cola on my Eat Badly plate? And then immediately they had to come up with this new guide that had to replace the plate and get rid of the can of Coca-Cola. But that was the main driver for the whole change in 2016. So I did an article in the British Journal of Sports Medicine in 2016 because I found out who Public Health England invited to design that plate. I actually went back through all the committee documents and found out they'd selected or invited 11 members, and 8 of them were fake food industry reps. And when I say reps, I mean they were the rep for the Institute of Grocery Distribution, which is then representative of about 500 other fake food companies, or the Food and Drink Federation, or the, Association of Convenience Stores. They invited the wolves in to
Yeah.
design what the hen house should look like. And I had a paper published on that. And again, they were tampons. So
And
I
lo and
think it's,
behold, when you leave the foxes in charge of the hen house, some chickens are going to come up missing. And so what you're saying is, like we all see when we watch a movie and we see the actor obviously drink a can of Coke with Coca-Cola perfectly placed. That's called product placement.
yeah.
And they typically pay the director, producer, whoever to say, hey, we want him to drink a Coke here if that's okay, if that fits in the plot. And they're like, yeah, okay, 10 grand, 100 grand, whatever.
Wow.
That's called product placement. So you're telling me that the big food industry actually got product placement, and for some undisclosed, we don't know if they maybe didn't even have to pay if they had enough people on the committee. There's literal product placement on the food guidelines.
I don't think there are actual brands. So it was pretty obvious in the 2007 plate that it was a box of Kellogg's cornflakes and it was a can of Coca-Cola. It didn't have Coca-Cola on it, but it was red. It was a can of cola.
Sure.
They kind of took away that subtle connection to brands, but they were
When
absolutely
after they were called out.
Exactly.
Yes.
But they're clearly telling people, for breakfast, you have cereal, you don't have eggs, you have sandwiches, you have pasta, you have pizza, you have ready meals, you have potatoes. Base your meals on starchy foods. That message from 1984 spelled out has not changed in the last 40 years.
That's blows my mind. So to sum up the fat, saturated fat occurs predominantly in animal-based foods. There are definitely plant sources of saturated fat, but the average plant-based person is fine with you eating an avocado. They're fine with that. They're not going to demonize you for that. But if you're eating a ribeye or you're eating, oh, God forbid, bacon, then that is going to be demonized. And so animal-based saturated fat has been and it continues to be thoroughly demonized. And I think that it's because you cannot scale up animal-based foods. It's really hard to take a cow and wind up with a 10,000% markup on that when you get to market. You just can't do that. But with subsidized grains and subsidized sugar and subsidized vegetable seed oils, you can literally make anything from a pizza crust to a donut to a ding dong to 1,000 other products that all, to the uneducated consumer's eyes, it looks like a different product.
Yeah.
Oh no, this is pizza crust. That's different from tortilla wraps. That's different from, a honey bun. No, essentially they're exactly the same thing. They just have different ratios of sugar, vegetable seed oils, and grains. They're essentially the same product. All three of those things, at least in the United States, are subsidized. It makes them much, much cheaper. And then so you wind up with this low fat, cholesterol-free, hopefully saturated fat-free product that's going to be high in carbs, high in sugar, high in vegetable seed oils. That's what's going to be put on the supermarket shelf.
So I have a slide that I get a few gasps from when I present it at conferences. And I take a raw steak because when you cook things, you change them. So we should always look at food per 100 grams in the raw situation. And it's one of the USDA steaks. So it's one of the ones from the United States Department of Agriculture All Foods database. It's not the kind of fatty ribeye necessarily, but I think I took a sirloin and then I present it as a graph. So I say, okay, raw piece of steak, 71% water, 71 of the 100 grams is water. So food is predominantly water, real food anyway, is predominantly water.
That's right.
Next thing it is 21% protein, 21 grams of protein. You've then got things like minerals and ash. It came down to about 7% fat, 7 grams of fat. And what people don't realize is that the main fat in meat is not saturated fat. It's usually monounsaturated fat.
Right.
And certainly if you add monounsaturated fat to the puffer, so you take the total unsaturated fat, it is always higher than the saturated fat. So another thing I like to say at conferences, there is only, if you think of 9 food groups, so I think I said them earlier, meat, fish, eggs, dairy, veg, fruit, nuts and seeds, I put those together, legumes and grains. Of those 9 food groups, there is only one food group that has more saturated fat and unsaturated fat, and that is dairy products. But interestingly, it applies no matter what the dairy product is. So if you take a low-fat milk that only has 1% fat, 60% of that 1% is saturated fat. So even in the low fat milk, because it is a rule, it's an absolute rule that dairy products are the only food group that have got more saturated than unsaturated fat. And then of course you look at some of the research that's come out recently and they say, oh no, but dairy is actually quite good because there are some conflicts in the dairy industry. You've got Mozzafari and Arnastrup or whatever. They quite like the whole sort of dairy thing. So it's what you've just said. Oh, saturated fat in dairy is actually okay. That's heart healthy. That's good for you. But when there's some saturated fat in meat, even though there's less as a proportion, then that's not good for you. And of course, in eggs, that's not good for you either. But there are traces of saturated fat in strawberries.
Yes.
I mean, I'll post a picture on my
sure.
my Twitter if people don't. There's traces of saturated fat in everything other than sucrose, because sucrose is the only thing that's 100% carbohydrate. So the whole thing is mad when you look into it. Fish has got more saturated fat and more total fat, oily fish, than red meat. But they tell us oily fish is good for us and red meat is bad for us.
Exactly. Yeah. So in reality, it has nothing to do with the macronutrients or the amount of saturated fat or the ratio. It's just that these are animals and you shouldn't eat. And they really tend to focus on terrestrial animals because it's okay to eat fish and seafood. That's considered healthy. But animals that have legs, and I would say it's mammals. You shouldn't eat mammals. That's really because they're okay with you eating bugs. They're okay with you eating seafood. They're okay with, I guess, you eating, lizards and other things. But the mammals, you cannot eat the mammals. They are bad for you. That's kind of the unspoken but yet pervasive message. So let's turn to fiber, because literally everything on the supermarket shelf that's in a cardboard box in the center of the store, it says something like good source of fiber, now higher in fiber, full of fiber, 20% of your recommended daily allowance of fiber. Fiber has to have just hard science behind it. 1 + 1 = 2. Fiber is an essential nutrient, and you must eat fiber or you will die prematurely of some terrible disease. Walk us through this fiber thing. Where did this come from? How is it so pervasive? And what's the actual research supporting fiber as an essential nutrient?
Okay. Where it comes from is what I mentioned earlier with the research that Belinda has done and any of us can do. And I did it for a fiber presentation. It goes back to Sylvester Graham and John Harvey Kellogg and the Seventh-day Adventists and a woman called Ellen White. And the Seventh-day Adventists believed that meat was basically bad for men. It made them lustful and aggressive or whatever, or macho, and therefore men mustn't have meat. Basically, they would start masturbating and doing terrible things like that. So,
and they didn't have the terminology back then, but basically what they're saying is that when a man eats fatty red meat, it raises his testosterone.
Yeah,
and we now know that that's absolutely true, and that's also absolutely a good thing. But to them, they thought that sexual desire, lust, was a sin, and many people still believe that. But I promise everybody watching this, you want the man in your life, whether that's your dad, your husband, your brother, your son, your grandson. You want them to have a good, high, healthy testosterone. Sorry to interrupt.
As a woman, I wholeheartedly agree. Yeah, if you want a proper man, put the other ones back in the gene pool. Yes, but they didn't want that. There's a good connection actually. I hadn't made the testosterone connection before, but they didn't want that. They thought fiber kept men regular and wholesome. And that's sort of the origin of it. If you sort of wind forward to today, and I have done this, if you go on my site and look under categories, videos, there's an open view half-an-hour presentation on fiber where I go through all of this, and you've got all the references in there as well. Wind forward to what's actually in the dietary guidelines, and they do it by age. So from memory, a male over 51 needs 28 grams of fiber every single day, apparently, with no evidence base whatsoever.
Needs
right? Must have.
And so what I'm implying there is that fiber has never been declared by any regulatory agency or any scientific group to be an essential nutrient. And the word essential has a very specific definition in this context. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that they say you need fiber all the time, but I don't think it's actually been scientifically declared an essential nutrient yet, has it?
No, it totally hasn't. Right, so let's just cover that off. So we need to do a carbohydrate 101. So carbohydrate 101, we start off with monosaccharides, single sugars, and those are glucose, fructose, and galactose. We then have disaccharides, two sugars. People have got to realize that carbohydrates are just sugar.
Yes.
The disaccharides are sucrose, which is one molecule of glucose, one molecule of fructose. Lactose, the milk sugar, which is galactose and glucose. And then maltose, which we don't hear about very often, which is two molecules of glucose.
Yes.
Go up a level, you then get polysaccharides, poly meaning many, so that's just many sugars. We get many sugars of the digestible kind, and that would be glycogen in a human, and that would be starch in a plant. And then you get many sugars, polysaccharides of the indigestible kind, and that's fiber, basically. So the definition of fiber is polysaccharides of the indigestible kind, and it can either then be soluble or insoluble. Soluble just means it swells in water like oats. Insoluble means it doesn't swell in water like bran. So that's basically your carbohydrate 101. So you can re-term fiber indigestible many sugars. So immediately you should be saying, why would many sugars that I can't digest be good for me? Then you can go to the US panel on macronutrients from 2005, which has that brilliant quote where it says, in fact, I've probably got it here, the lower limit of dietary carbohydrate compatible with life apparently is 0, provided that adequate amounts of protein and fat are consumed. So we have a statement that says carbohydrate is not an essential nutrient. There are no essential carbohydrates. There are essential fats and there are essential proteins. There's no essential carbohydrates. You now know that fiber is a subset of carbohydrate. So if carbohydrate is non-essential, then fiber is non-essential. Now you can just end it there. If you want to end the debate with your mother-in-law or your friend there, you can just say QED, fiber is a non-essential nutrient. We have no need for it whatsoever. What I then do in the presentation is I say, okay, we don't need it, but then we don't need laughter, but it sure as hell is good for us. So is it good for us? And then you go back and look at the evidence. So I looked at, first of all, the RCT evidence. There's only one large and long enough RCT, which is the DART study that was published by Burr and colleagues back in 1989, involved 2,000 people, always men. 2 years of study. They did fish interventions, fat interventions, and fiber interventions. Actually, more people died in the fiber group, both of any cause and heart disease causes, but it wasn't statistically significant, but it wasn't going in the right direction. So that's the RCT evidence. Cochrane concluded we need more trials. There is no evidence. So all that they rely on, and we're getting to the end of this point now, all that they rely on is what we call the population studies. Now, picture the family that has quinoa and artichokes and kumquat and nuts and seeds and pecans and all the rest of it. They're affluent, they're educated, yes. Their children are called Tarquin and Olivia and that kind of thing. So that is your family that is eating a lot of fiber. The fiber didn't make them healthy, it's just a marker of the type of people that they are. And then swing over to the obese couple that are grabbing a Big Mac and fries with extras on the side in the mall, who don't eat vegetables and fibre and quinoa and whatever. And the fibre has got nothing to do with anything. You're judging two completely different people. And as Gary Taubes says it, he puts this so beautifully. He says, epidemiology is basically saying that if only those people ate like those people, they would be as healthy as those people. And it just isn't the case. That overweight, obese, low income, less educated, living on the breadline, no advantage in life couple is never going to be like that affluent couple over here, no matter how many pecan nuts they eat. It's just a complete fallacy. And that's the only evidence that they have. So you don't eat fibre, and I actually don't think it's particularly good for you. And then people say, oh, what about gut flora? There are many, many ways to look after your gut flora that have nothing whatsoever to do with beans on toast, I can assure you.
Let me ask you a question. If fiber were declared to be officially an essential nutrient, that would help big food and indirectly big pharma. Why do you think that hasn't happened? Is the research just so horrendous that they would be laughed out of the room? Why have they not attempted that?
That's a really good question. It has to be what you've just said, that it would be so bad, that it wouldn't take long for somebody to go through that carbohydrate 101 that I've just gone through to say, that is impossible. There is no essential carbohydrate. It is a carbohydrate. It can't be an essential nutrient. And it may be that even they thought that was going a bit too far, and that it would undermine the rest of the evidence that they're giving. So they really do kind of go about it from the other route, say, oh, you must have fiber for your gut flora or whatever. You must have fiber to speed the passage of food through your body. Well, I think my body's going to put food through at the right rate. I mean, if I have meat, it's going to take longer because there's a lot more nutrients in meat and my body needs to take them out. It doesn't want to just get rid of them out the other end without me having had all the goodness. And then, of course, they're pushing these GLP-1 agonists at the moment where the food stays in your stomach for about a week. So come on, guys, make your mind up. Do you want it out quickly or in for the next 7 days?
Exactly.
Leave
Now,
it alone.
I think I think you have brilliantly put the argument for both fat and fiber. I don't think that anybody could have put it more eloquently. So thank you for those two things. Now we're going to turn. We're gonna pull out the politically aware Zoë Harcombe, the Zoë Harcombe who watches the worldwide news and the political winds and how they blow. We earlier talked about people in the low carb keto carnivore community. We self-silo basically, where we surround ourselves by people who understand a proper human diet, and we just assume the rest of the world knows about this as well. But I want, first of all, what percentage of just the world population do you think, if you said what's better for your health, a ketogenic diet or a standard American or Western diet, what percentage of people around the world, the entire global population, what percentage would even know what the hell you're talking about? Number
really
one.
low.
And then number two, and what I want to spend the remainder of this hour on is how do we change that as an individual, as a small group, as a larger group? How do we get this information in front of people? How do we change the guidelines? How do we change things at the county level, the state level, and the federal level? How do we erase this foolishness that saturated fat's bad for you and fiber's good for you? How do we get this out of the public zeitgeist? How do we change that?
Okay, so I mean, the first question, if you look at where the population is in the world, it's mostly in India and China. India struggle to eat across en masse on the continent. So I don't think they're worrying about dietary guidelines or keto diets, although they have a massive issue with diabetes and obesity. They become diabetic at much lower weights than other ethnicities across the world. China seemed to have gone the other way in that they started off with a fairly good diet. They would eat pork and vegetables and some rice, but they were quite active. And then, of course, they've imported the all-American diet. So they're kind of going in the wrong direction. Among what I'd call the so-called developed world, Australia, New Zealand, Europe, UK, America, Canada, I don't know that many people think the standard American diet is healthy, but I don't think they're switched on to the fact of just how unhealthy it is. I don't think they've made that connection between, oh, we only had one fat person in the school and now we've got all of these. I think most people are just too busy. They're too busy watching that box in the corner, pumping out the propaganda. They're in debt. They're worried about their community. They're worried about their family health because they're not healthy. I think one of the big aims of, whatever you want to call them, the parasite class, the deep state, whatever, I think one of their big aims is just to keep us in debt, to keep us scared of various things, whether it's epidemics that they've invented or global warming, whatever that they've decided is a story. So they want us preoccupied, scared, and in debt, and they manage to do that very well. So I think very few people are actually in a good place to be able to say, I'm going to reject all of that propaganda that's coming in from outside. I'm going to look after me and my community and do the right thing and ignore all health advice that comes from over there. How do we change it? So I always sort of think there's a pyramid in this situation. At the top of the pyramid, the bit that would make the single biggest change is what Nina Teicholz has devoted so much of her time to. And we've just had the delight of hosting Nina for 4 days. So we've been chatting about everything during that time. If you could change the dietary guidelines at the top, particularly in America, it would actually then filter out to those other so-called developed countries. That would be the big win. I'd kind of written it off ever happening. Nina hasn't, and all credit to her, because that would just be monumental. It would have such an impact it is just the one you can't give up on, I guess. Down at the bottom, we've got what we're a part of, which is the bottom-up revolution. So people see you and it's like, how can you eat so much and you're still slim and you look really healthy and you've got energy all day long, and you tell them, they try it and they do it and then they convert more people. That's really slow. The one that I'm sort of excited about, or I'm really still hoping Nina pulls it off, is this sort of middle level. And you are on this middle level as well as on the bottom level. So it's our educators, it's our doctors, it's our teachers who've discovered the truth and who then want to share it with other people. Now you have an enormous community across your YouTube channel and people who support what you do, absolutely enormous. You can reach 3 million people. And that is just incredible. I mean, that's more than any family doctor can do. And more, I think, are realizing, like Jason Fung, that you can have an even bigger impact talking to people through the new mediums than you can just meeting in the clinic with a few people. And that is really then going to spread, because if you can reach a few 100,000 people and then they start transforming their health and then their family and friends spot what's happening, that's when we really get the growth. And you kind of say, look, if only one person could tell 2 people, and then that person can tell 2 people. You know, I remember being in love with numbers. My dad saying to me when I was a kid, you know, put a penny on that square on the chessboard and then double it and then double it and then work out how much you've got when you get to the other end of the chessboard. It's phenomenal. It's the whole world, several times over. So there are a number of ways in which we can do this. And I'm glad that different people in the same field, you, me, David Unwin, Nina Teicholz, Jason Fung, Tim Noakes, all of them, we're all doing our bit within that pyramid.
I totally agree. And I'm increasingly more interested in that middle level, where we use social media to kind of as a multiplier to magnify this message. And I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but me and a group of low carb, keto understanding doctors, we have started the American Diabetes Society, which is going to be live in just a few weeks, and to directly counter the American Diabetes Association and all related associations who give terrible advice. This morning on Twitter, the American Diabetes Association posted a tweet. We are committed to eliminating the stigma around type 2 diabetes. And so I retweeted that and said, well, actually, I am committed to eliminating type 2 diabetes.
Yeah, you've got to have a word in there you didn't need. Oh
exactly.
My God,
you added something you didn't need. And there was a comment from a guy, because yesterday on Twitter, I had said that the diet you eat is 100 times more powerful in preventing or causing type 2 diabetes than your genetics. And a guy, a earnest guy, one of the millions out there who has no idea about this stuff, he was basically like, oh my God, I've lost my grandmother, my mom, and my aunt to type 2 diabetes. And I have become this idiot proselytizing to my family that type 2 diabetes is genetic. And now I've suddenly realized, no, it's dummy. It's the food that you're eating and the food you're feeding your family. That's the guy. His name was Mike. There are millions of Mikes out there who, if you ask them on the street, what causes type 2 diabetes? Is it the food you eat or genetics? Oh, it's genetics, of course. It's just, no, it's common knowledge. It's genetics, when that's absolutely false. But the question is, how do we reach the millions upon millions of Mikes out there around the world who are convinced that type 2 diabetes is a genetic condition? How do we reach them, Zoë Harcombe? Your final word.
It has to be one way through that pyramid. It's the only way we can do it. It's bottom up, it's in the middle, it's from the top down. And I would just pray that something would happen at the top down, because the difference it could make, you have to come to the conclusion that they don't want to do that, because they could do it. They are not that stupid. There is somebody at the ADA, not your one, the one that wants to keep diabetes going. There is someone there who knows all of this. And there is someone in the UK organisation who knows all of this. And yet they are still pumping out the message that you need to eat starchy foods, you need to eat carbs and not fat. They're giving the exact opposite advice in terms of how to put diabetes into remission. It's criminal. They're either conflicted or incompetent, and I don't think they're that incompetent. So I think they're conflicted.
It would be hard to be that incompetent, wouldn't it?
It would. Yeah, I mean, I hope that one of these mics, I hope, sues them and says, do you know what? You killed my grandma and you killed my mum and you could have killed me. But I heard this guy, Ken Berry, who told me I just had to change what I ate, and I did. And I now don't have type 2 diabetes anymore. And my doctor will confirm it. So I'm suing you because from where I'm sat, you wanted to kill me. And it's going to take something like that. It really is.
To get worldwide media coverage and to get discovery to from the private emails of the American Diabetes Association.
Yeah.
The private Slack messages, because Zoë Bliss, she's a bit of a conspiratorialist like me. We understand that the majority of bad things are caused by ignorance and incompetence, but I believe at the very top there's a little bit of malice going on. And if we could get discovery into that malice and then broadcast that nationwide and worldwide, I think that would wake a lot of people up. Zoë Harcombe, where can people find you if they just love this interview, which I know they did?
Oh, that's very nice. So what my hubby has put on the screen there, at Zoë Harcombe, that's my Twitter handle. I'm going to look for that tweet and I'll retweet it soon. My website is just zoeharcombe.com. And what I do every week is I take an academic paper and I dissect it so that you don't have to. So, I mean, last autumn one went mental, which was the red meat causes diabetes. I mean, you were all hearing that saying, well, that isn't even possible. That's mad. But then I go and look at the paper and I tear it apart and I come up with the 12 reasons why it is a complete load of nonsense, and it saves you having to bother. So that's me on Twitter and on my website. And thank you very much for having me.
It's such a pleasure. And any doctor, any dietitian, any nutritionist, if you want to know the truth about feeding a human being, you need to subscribe to her newsletter. I'm a subscriber, and every week when something new comes out, I cannot wait to see what Zoë Harcombe has found out about this nutritional myth. So thank you very much, Dr. Harcombe. It's been a pleasure. This will be posted on YouTube, and everybody, I'll have links in the show notes to Zoe's social media and to her website if you want to follow her. Thank you so much, Zoë.
Thanks so much.